Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be making a cherry pie with a graham cracker crust. This differs from your traditional cherry pie both in the graham cracker crust and also in that we will be using gelatin because I was looking for something a little bit more firm than a normal pie filling. So instead of thickening it with cornstarch, we're going to be using gelatin today. I would like to thank everyone who has subscribed and who's sharing the videos and watching the videos. Thank you as always. It means the world to me. And if you're here and you haven't already, subscribe for more videos like this and for other videos just diving into all kinds of the details of cooking and food. Beginning with our crust, the ingredients we will need are 1.5 cup crushed graham crackers, a quarter cup of sugar, a half a teaspoon cinnamon, and 6 tablespoons melted butter. So for our graham crackers, if you don't have a food processor, I'll show you what to do there. If you have a food processor, just toss them in, blitz them until it's powdered. No big deal. If you don't, what you can do easily is take just a regular sandwich bag and put part of them in there. I happen to have a mallet for this, but really you could use your fists, you could use anything as long as it crushes them to the point where they're close to powder. If you want a really, really smooth graham cracker crust, you want to get them all the way to powder, and that's going to take a little longer, but does give you that very smooth one. Now, I prefer a little bit more of a crunchy one. I prefer a little bit more of some of the chunks of graham to still be there. So I'll usually just break it down with a mallet like this. It'll probably take me like 3 or 4 minutes to do all of them. But again, because I like that texture of having just some of the pieces that are still whole chunks of graham cracker in the crust, this works really well for that. Whereas if you want them completely crushed, then obviously the food processor is going to work better. But you can get either result with both. In the food processor, you can just kind of sort of blitz it on and off just long enough to get it mostly particleized. Or if you have the hammer or just your fist and you want to crush it, you can just keep crushing until you're happy with the size. If you are doing it by the hand or with a mallet like I'm doing here, one thing to note is that the bag, a regular sandwich bag, will only tend to hold just about enough to do half the graham crackers in the package. And that one package, by the way, is just perfect for about the 1.5 cups. I've almost never seen it go more than like 5 or 10% either way. So one package of those works perfect. Don't even have to measure the 1.5 cups. Jumping ahead a moment to when we're done with the crushing of all the graham crackers, one thing I wanted to point out was once you get it in the bowl, if you're doing this by hand, you can catch all those last little huge pieces, larger ones. So this is also a good place if you're doing this by hand and don't have a food processor where you can fix some of the bigger ones that may have been missed by the hammer or however you were crushing them. So this is the time you want to look at that. Alright, so our last stop on our crust before the oven, we're going to mix everything. I usually just give the dry ingredients a good mix beforehand just to make sure everything's in there. So especially when you have things like cinnamon and stuff like that, because if you got a pocket of like where cinnamon had ended up being just cinnamon in there for like a little some of it, it actually wouldn't taste that great, as good as it actually sounds, because the cinnamon flavor would just be overwhelming at that point. And you also wouldn't want to hit like a patch that's just sugar. So what I wanted to do here, I saw a couple more pieces that were a little bit bigger, and again, this is kind of before you pour the butter in, this is the last time you could possibly get rid of some of your bigger chunks. Once you do get the butter in, it's going to form into about the same consistency as like a crumble or a crisp topping, because you're not really going to have sort of a dough out of this. What's going to happen is the butter is going to melt out when we bake it, and then when you let it cool, it's all going to kind of congeal and dry together and stay together somewhat. Graham cracker crusts don't stay too much together, but for the pie today, it's more than enough. Alright, once everything is mixed in and we are ready to go, we just want to get our pie tin and put our mixture into that. Now, in the beginning, it's important to press some out, but you also want to leave it more in the center than you start pressing out towards the outsides. Now, the reason for that is once you get to the outsides, you're going to end up pressing a lot of the material from the center outwards just by trying to press it down and get even coverage. So as you're getting that even coverage, you end up pushing a ton to the outside. So if you leave that little mound in the middle and kind of push out from the outer like 75%, you'll get to the point where also it'll start stretching down there, and then you're like, okay, now I just need to spread out the center a little bit more, and that'll give me the even coverage that I'm looking for. In these particular pies, you generally won't be able to get a very nice looking edge of the crust at the very top unless you go back, and that's probably what we'll do depending on how delicate it is. You can basically take a paring knife and go back and cut so you can flatten it out and make the nice top ring very flat and even, or you could just leave it all rough and rustic. That works too. In my case, if I can, I'll probably clean it up a little bit. Oh, we have a couple cat pile up at the old food bowl back there. Sorry, they're just cats. They're cute. So basically, all you want to do here, though, is make sure that your corners don't end up being huge. Because a lot of times if you look at one of these pies and you get a graham cracker crust that's homemade, you'll find that the bottom corner where it meets the outer wall is just so thick. It's way too thick. And it's not that it ruins the pie, but it does make it kind of diminishes it a little bit, because instead of the last couple of bites being just sort of this really nice crust and pie mix, it's not. So if you do have any of the like big, very large places knocked out on the top, you can take a little bit and move a little bit just to get it kind of even. It's always nice to have it somewhat even. Once it's all pressed out, we're going to go into a oven preheated to 375 degrees for about 8 minutes, or until it starts to look just a little bit golden brown. You don't want it to go the full way. When you pull it out, the crust is going to be very soft, and while it's still warm, it'll be very soft. Once it cools fully, you'll want to wait at least an hour. It will solidify, and it will no longer feel like it's going to mush out like Play-Doh. So just don't worry about that once you get it all cool, and you want to cool it for at least an hour before you do any of the filling. Optimally, cool it in the refrigerator, and that'll give you the best results, but still stay with it at least an hour. For our filling, we're going to need 4.5 cups red cherries, pitted, 1 cup orange juice, a half a cup of sugar, and 1 package unflavored gelatin. On to our cherries. Now, I actually forgot to record this part, so I got lucky that I had it still from the Aqua Fresca episode. So, as you can see here, as I'm demonstrating the cherry pitter, if you have a cherry pitter, it's much, much better to use that, and it's the most convenient and clean way you can do it. But, as I did mention in that episode, if you don't use a lot of cherries, you're probably not going to need one of these. And I'll show you in just a second with the same footage again, reused because I forgot to record, the knife version. It's a little messier. It's a lot messier, sorry. But it is just as easy, and it'll just take a lot longer. So, with the knife, otherwise known as how to make your cutting board look like a murder scene, by who's in the back there, what you want to do is just take your cherry and roll it backwards, or just slice a circle around the pit, and then you can just pick the pit out with your fingers. As I mentioned before in the last episode when I did this, the pit is going to be harder to remove on fresher strawberries. So if you have a couple day old strawberries, that's a good way to go. And in most cases, I would also say a lot of times frozen cherries are the way to go. In this case, we want to do something very particular, so frozen cherries will not work for this recipe. Do not cut in the air like I just did. That is literally the warning. Don't do that. It's bad. Alright, once you are finished up with your cherries, you are ready to start. Now, generally when I add the ingredients, I usually start with the orange juice and then the sugar. So it just kind of has a little bit of a head start on dissolving into it, and then I'll put all the cherries in. Now you're going to want to heat this on medium, or maybe just a little bit of a medium, depending on your stove and whether or not it comes up to a full boil. You want it to be, for most of this time, at not a rolling boil, but it bubbles. It's bubbling, so the first stage of boiling. And in my case, that's just a touch over medium. In your case, it may be slightly lower, slightly higher. Stray pit. I was actually lucky to find that. That could have been, in some ways, unfortunate slice of pie. Alright, so one of the things we're definitely looking for here is you'll see it first happening in the orange juice. Your orange juice is going to slowly, as you're stirring, shift from bright orange to sort of a orangish, reddish color, and then eventually it's going to look just dark red. Just the pigment of the cherries overwhelming the amount of orange in the orange juice. Alright, I'm going to show you a few times of what kind of the signs you're looking for in a few of these clips while I was stirring. Like 40 minutes of it. Nobody needs to watch that. As you can see here, this is our orange juice is already changing color like I was saying, and some of the cherries, you can't really see it in this. They are starting to soften just a little bit. At this point in the cooking, it'll kind of foam just a little bit. You don't have to worry about that. It's not going to hurt anything. It's nothing you need to worry about. Eventually, it'll just stop foaming, so you don't have to pay attention to that at all. You can just stir it and mix it in. The reason that it's foaming now and won't be foaming later is as it thickens up a little bit, as the actual liquid which we are reducing in this step, as that thickens up a little bit, we actually will end up with almost all of the foam just disappearing after a certain point of where the thickness of the liquid is too thick to support the bubbles. At this point, it's not. Once it's been bubbling for about 10 minutes to possibly 15, it'll start to look like this. And you're going to notice that all the skin on the outside of the cherries is starting to sag a little bit, and the liquid volume stopped going down even though we were reducing things. And that's because at this point, when it starts to get soft like this, that's when the cherries are releasing their juice naturally from the heat. And that's going to add a bunch of liquid that we're going to continue to reduce down because we want a very intense cherry flavor. And this one's going to be a little bit on the tart side because we're not going to use too much sugar in this filling. And so that allows us to have a little bit of the tart side of the cherries as the highlighted flavor. The orange juice is going to play off that and basically highlight that taste while offering a citrusy burst in the background that just kind of rounds off all the tastes and makes them all form together really well and gives you a very nice cherry pie that's a tart pie, but not so tart that you're like, oh, geez, not that one. At about the 20-minute mark, you'll notice, as you can see here, the foam is starting to go down just a little bit, and again, that was what I was mentioning. Also, you'll notice that the water has turned a very, very deep red, and somewhat, like I said, almost matching the darker of the cherries in this. And it will continue to get darker red. By the time this is done, this is going to be an extremely dark red. It's also going to taste really good. And you can see here, some of these are starting to get just a little bit soft, like that one right there in the middle. And you'll see a couple of them where they're starting to get flexible. Now, when I say getting soft, I mean more than just, you can push on it with the spatula. But in this case, I want them to actually start folding down on themselves. And that's the softness I'm going for. That's the first of two visual cues for our cherries to being almost done. And the other one is the juice itself, and I'll explain that once we get to that part of the video. Jumping ahead to the last of the boiling, mine was about 35 minutes, and you can see what it looks like here. Most of the cherries are starting to sag. They don't hold that sort of cherry shape, except for very few of them. And I would like to keep that. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm checking for what they call Nappè. This is the liquid should coat the back of the spoon, and when I pass my finger through it, it should not reclose rapidly. And since that's the first part of the two thickening agents we're using, we want to make sure that it reaches this point. Then we know that we're ready to go on to the next part. And that is the final mixing of the gelatin that we're going to bloom into this mixture. But first, somewhat like our pie crust, this needs to cool for probably about 20 to 30 minutes. You want it to be almost room temperature. Alright, so we are going to bloom our gelatin, and all that means is we're going to rehydrate it, and we're going to do it in 1/4 cup of water. Room temperature water, whatever coming out of your cold tap water will work perfectly. Now, it's not going to get super thick here. Sometimes you'll have gelatin that does, and if it does, it'll end up looking somewhat like an applesauce. But mostly for most people, at the very beginning, it's just going to look sort of like cloudy water. And what we're looking for is to either become that applesauce-like texture or to become ever so slightly thick with all of the water being cloudy, and that cloudiness is from the gelatin, so that cloudiness lets us know it's on its way. If you're lucky and it goes completely in applesauce texture, that is great. That means it's actually going to set up probably a little firmer than mine is going to. And in the case of anyone whose water just sort of turns cloudy, they're going to be not quite as firm as a regular Jell-O. And the reason that I'm using gelatin in this recipe is I remember a dish I had when I was a child, and it was a strawberry pie made with some gelatin and fresh strawberries, and it sounded excellent, and was. And this, I was trying to get a little bit of a duplication on that, so you'd have that sort of soft set Jell-O, so you could still cut it with a fork and all that, but to have it just a little firmer than a regular pie crust, so you could get sort of that almost clean edge. So let's skip ahead, and this just needs to sit for just 4 to 5 minutes, and it'll get to where you can see it blooming in there and see it noticeably being thicker. Once we are all bloomed and ready to go, we just need to pour it in, and you want to make sure, especially if yours didn't bloom out into the applesauce-like texture, if it's a little thinner, you want to make sure you get all the stuff from the outsides of your measuring cup or whatever you used to transport it, because that stuff is going to grow by fairly large volume, so you definitely want to have it in here. And once we're all done with that, we just need to pour it into our pie crust. And after that, we're going to have to let it sit for a while. Alright, last stop before we go into the refrigerator. All we need to do here is to just pour the cherries in and kind of let everything... You're just going to want to spread it out to where the thickness and the level of it is pretty much even. Now, if I had thought about it, and my fiance actually suggested it later, had I thought about it, I would have put a layer of oats down at the bottom just to make sure the graham cracker crust was a little more separate from the cherry juice while it's setting, and that would have actually probably helped out quite a bit. Plus, if you do that, those oats, that little layer of oats tastes amazing, so I can definitely recommend doing that, although I did not here. And as I said, for this, all you want to do is just get it as level as possible. That way it'll look nice when we decorate it with whatever we can decorate it with. Hopefully some whipped cream. So, once you're all done with that, it needs to go into the refrigerator for a minimum of 2 hours, preferably overnight, and everything should be set up fully at that point. And once it's fully set, your pie is ready. Now this is going to end up with a consistency somewhere in between a soft set jello and a regular pie. One of the advantages it allows is, if you see in these pictures, you can get a very smooth side other than where your cherries are. Now had I macerated or mashed up the cherries a little bit more into smaller pieces, you would have an even more smooth side and there wouldn't be sort of the big bulges. But I wanted that whole cherry experience in there. And this taste-wise exceeded all of my expectations. The graham cracker crust and the cherry pie filling just go together perfect. So I want to thank you for watching and have a good day and a great meal.